Good morning. We're running it just a couple minutes late, so just gonna let everyone in, but jump right in. And I just want to make sure that you are where you intended to be, which is the Inclusive Innovation and Energy for the Future session, a panel. If you plan to be in the regional broadband session, I'm just going to paste the agenda into the chat because that has the links for the other sessions in case you intended to be elsewhere. But again, just want to thank Otelco for being our tech sponsor for this event. And then I'm going to hand it over to Andrew Butcher, President of the Maine Connectivity Authority, to kick off this panel, and I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krista. Thanks for all of your help in producing today's session. Hi, friends. Nice to see you all. We've got a great session planned for today. Some spectacular speakers and panelists, and this is a great group, so I'm excited to see some questions that come in. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, I am Andrew Butcher. I'm honored to have been nominated by Governor Mills to serve as president of the Connectivity Authority. And I do this after a couple of years of work, both working on a regional scale with the Greater Portland Council of Governments, as well as serving as the staffing capacity for the Broadband Coalition. So this is I think at large, a spectacular conversation through the course of yesterday and today. And I really want to make sure I just do give some credit and some thanks to the range of sponsors for today's and yesterday's sessions. So our backbone, middle mile, and last mile sponsors. This is incredible. I don't think the coalition has ever had this level of engagement and sponsorship from a range of technology providers, from financial institutions, from partners around the state. So I just thank you all for participating. We're going to jump into today's session because this is going to be a mind-blowing conversation. We have just tremendous expertise joining us, and my job is to stop talking as quick as possible. So if you're joining us today, you're here because you're interested really in the future, and you're interested in people, and you're interested in creative and bold solutions for the future. So the prospect of inclusive innovation and energy for the future, one of the joys of working on broadband and connectivity is that we spend a lot of time talking about how we're going to do it, what needs to get done, what are the challenges, what are the costs, what are the models. It's both joyful and excruciating, as everybody on this call knows. And I think in this sort of annual gathering of broadband advocates and partners throughout Maine, it's pretty important to think about the why and what are we really aiming for, and what are the goals and principles and values that we want to try to embed within our overall strategies and plans. And this is very much at the core of what we at the Connectivity Authority and certainly at Connect Maine have been trying to think through. And so really at the core of today's conversation is how we go about achieving the future that we want to see is really important, and who's a part of that process is essential. So I'm not going to spend time introducing each of our speakers. I know we just heard from Susan. I'm going to give a very, very brief intro to Debra and to Seth. I'm especially excited to have both of you here because of your unique and different perspectives. Debra is joining us from Georgia and is an old friend of mine from Pittsburgh. Debra was the first Chief Innovation and Performance Officer for the city of Pittsburgh after a pretty illustrious career in climate and performance management with some global expertise and perspective. The state of Georgia recruited her, and she's now been leading work through Georgia Tech statewide around regional smart infrastructure with a particular lens around inclusive innovation. And Debra, as probably one of the national experts around inclusive innovation and the new work that you've been doing with the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation and Inclusive Networks, So glad to have you here. I'm going to come to you in just a quick minute. After Debra, we are going to hear from Seth Hodel, the president of the Post Road Foundation, who many of you know through the work that they've been doing in evaluating the alignment of our energy and information systems. There's some exciting progress that's been taking shape with the Post Road Foundation with some federal support. So Seth, so glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us. And then Susan, I just need your small expertise in fusing each of the lens of expertise from everyone here. So, so glad for this. I'm going to stop talking. Debra, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you. I hope you've been well.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm not sure I can fully qualify for everything that you said, but it's nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, good. Thanks. So Deb, I have to say I was pretty inspired by your focus around inclusive innovation in Pittsburgh at a city level. I've seen that you've translated that to your work in Georgia, in particular around smart infrastructure and regional approaches. And I see that you've sort of expanded even more so in recognizing the role of multi-organizational collaborations. We don't really have the lexicon here in Maine that I know of around inclusive innovation. Can you sort of unpack for us around what it is and how you've seen it manifest in the various places that you've worked?
Yeah, I'm happy to start in Pittsburgh. So as Andrew noted, I was the Chief of Innovation and Performance at Pittsburgh, and this was a newly created position under an old area, which was the IT department. So every city had an IT department, and you know, most IT departments, like many cities, are internal facing, right? We just focus on keeping the lights on, if you will. And what Pittsburgh did was give me an opportunity to not only think about keeping the lights on, so it's grounded in operations, but to think more externally about building relations and partnerships that would spur innovation and entrepreneurship. And this was a recognition that Pittsburgh, you know, as great of a city it is, cannot do everything by itself. It was not something that, especially around innovation and entrepreneurships, not something that, you know, by a singular city mandate or legislation that they could do, nor do they necessarily have the funding or the expertise. So it was very necessary to really engage. And in Pittsburgh, as Andrew knows, we have a wealth of civic society leaders like himself, as well as top universities and institutions like Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. And then a growing, I would say, medical and tech sector. With Google and, you know, a growing autonomous vehicle research, as well as our UPMC health system. So that really created a good ecosystem, if you will, to start to collaborate. There's still a major leadership role that the city needs to do in order to incentivize you know, partnerships to come together, but it was definitely a recognition that the city is not the sole you know, entity to drive this type of work. Move to Atlanta and Georgia. We had a much bigger scale. Obviously, as many of you know, Atlanta is one of the few places in the US that's rapidly growing and rapidly, I would say, diversifying. It's going to be majority minority like the US very soon, and already has in some places. And so the need for Atlanta was a little bit different, unlike in Pittsburgh, because of that growth, but also because of the disparity and the inequality. So there's much to celebrate in Atlanta and Georgia in terms of the growth in sectors and certainly innovation. But what we recognize was that that growth and opportunity and celebration was siloed, meant that that growth wasn't shared, or those opportunities weren't shared across the state. So we were very intentional about trying to not just be a Silicon Valley. We didn't want just part of the state to grow and, you know, increase in disparity. If we were going to innovate and we were going to, you know, spur entrepreneurship, we wanted the whole state to be part of that process and that mission. It's very easy for us to just focus on Atlanta. because Atlanta has that natural ingredients, if you will. It's much harder to grow at a state level, but something that we were very intentional about doing from the get-go, because we knew that if we had a more inclusive process, it would result in a stronger, more sustainable outcome. And so how we defined inclusive innovation was thinking about increasing access and opportunities for everyone, all Georgians, to innovate. And that innovation wasn't the end state, but a way to essentially increase the quality of life and improve the human condition. And so we're trying to create the ecosystem to allow for greater access and opportunities for the whole state. And that was a very long history of Pittsburgh and Georgia, but hopefully that gives you a quick summary.
No, it's perfect. And, as Susan referenced, context matters. And so I appreciate that. Can you, given that context and the focus around innovation, as you said, is not the end state, but the means to an ends for creating access and opportunity for everyone. Can you drill into some of the types of partnerships that have manifested and how that's related to place-based investments in technology? Again, there's obviously a lot of broadband enthusiasts and advocates here today. Connectivity is a really important part of the equation. Digital equity is an essential part of our process and priorities and values. How has that manifested in some of the partnerships that you've been seeing and supporting in Georgia?
Well, let me highlight one thing that, I can't claim credit for, but it is a credit to, what is happening in the state. It was through our Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative, if you may heard. And so you all probably know about the FCC maps that look at broadband accessibility, and they look at the census block level, which is good, but it's probably not as detailed. Census block is 30,000 square miles, which is relatively big at the end of the day. And so the Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative actually looked at the neighborhood level. So it took it to a more finer, granular scale to actually understand where there is access and where there is not. And if you look at the FCC map for Georgia, it looks pretty good. It looks like we're pretty well covered because it's at the census block level. But others, I give them full credit, really went down to pointing out, we want to see if 80% of that census block actually has access, then that counts. And so once you use that scale, you see lots of parts of Georgia, frankly, that aren't very good with access. So beyond the urban core areas, and for those that Georgia, you have your Atlanta, and then like many states, you have some second tier cities. This is your Savannah, your Albany, your Augusta, Valdosta's, and those have some, but everywhere else is pretty sparse. So that was a starting point for us, just to understand where the need was. And keep in mind, this is just access. This is not subscription to that. So then you have to paint another layer to understand where is that affordability. And if you look at probably some of these major charts, you can see that actually Atlanta is one of the most unaffordable among major cities for internet access, despite, claims otherwise. New America put out a really good report that talked about the cost of internet, looking at the public facing plans and promotions, and Atlanta is actually one of the most expensive. And then you look at literacy, right? So if you have access, if you have the ability to afford it, and how do you actually apply it? And the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which I'm sure you're familiar with, looked at Georgia and saw that there was a huge gap. We have a lot of job openings, for instance, and we can't fill those job openings because our workers are not skilled in digital literacy, if you will. And so you look at this in terms of access, affordability, literacy, and it starts to paint a more nuanced picture of Georgia and what we can do. So with that information, we created something called broadband as a research service, using the university as the key. So we specifically targeted underserved areas of Georgia, and focused on what we call champions. Who are the advocates and the people that can actually implement change. And we essentially have a wraparound service. So we're working with Woodbury, Concord, Meriwether, and Pike County. These are in northern Georgia. Populations are, I would say, under 10,000, in some of these cities. So these are small communities. And thinking about what the wraparound research services are, thinking about understanding what's the stakeholder engagement, the terrain that's necessary to think about the technology, and then let the providers do what they need to do in terms of laying the technology out. So, we want to defer to that. But then once the technology is in, or once the service is in, thinking about the additional applications and economic development that can be done to build off of that technology. And so this kind of wraparound service provides a greater, I would say, empowerment for the communities to really capitalize on connectivity beyond just the physical infrastructure.
Oh man, you just keep me up with like two big questions, but I'm my worst job today is I have to keep us on time, which is bad news for everybody. But so Debra, I'm going to cede this question for you to come back to. We will have, we're going to hear from everybody for about 10 minutes, and then we will come back to sort of some ongoing Q&A. So I'm just going to plant this question now, and you can sort of marinate on it, because I'm hearing you talk about the role of problem identification, the role of utilization of data in an intentional way. You mentioned the identification of champions and the layering of digital literacy. And the ability to sort of hone and focus around economic development priorities. So you're assembling, as you said, the ecosystem for innovation, and sitting at both the technology, the infrastructure, the people-based and the place-based conversations. And so I would just, as we come back to dialogue later, I'd love to hear some of your insights around keys to success, or the special sauce of what it takes to sort of continue and to perpetuate those kinds of multi-sector, multi-organizational conversations towards a common focus and set of outcomes. So just marinate on that for a quick minute. But I want to change gears, because when we think about some of, another intersectoral type of initiative and orientation, Seth, the work that you and the Post Road Foundation have been doing for the last couple of years is sort of focused on this by design. And so for those that aren't familiar with the Post Road Foundation, can you give a quick overview and context of the work that you've been doing, and then bring us up to speed on where you're at with some of your most recent initiatives?
Let me, being a recovering scientist, I have to use slides. So let me, if you don't mind. Does those come up? All right, so the Post Road Foundation, we're a nonprofit. We're spun out of a research project at the Harvard Kennedy School in 2017. And we're presently funded by the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and just recently the Department of Energy. So we look to develop catalytic capital solutions to America's digital divide, as we've heard throughout this summit, and as Debra was speaking about. And our particular focus on that is integrating communications and electricity infrastructure, which I have some slides to talk about in more detail. We're very fortunate to benefit from some joint research collaborations with Efficiency Maine Trust, New Hampshire Electric Cooperative, Stanford here out in California, and also the Cyber Law Clinic, which Susan Crawford runs, and the Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, also at Harvard Law School. So we are compelled to focus on connectivity, of course, because it's just essential for human development in the 21st century, and all the things that we want to achieve. But we have this sort of diagram here sort of showing how it's really central to all sorts of objectives in the 21st century. Human development, economic development, but also greenhouse gas emission reductions, which is important in Maine, energy cost reductions, another important objective in Maine, education, as we know in the pandemic, it's absolutely essential, digital equity, of course, and also healthcare and telemedicine. I think something that's become even more important over the course of the pandemic, or it's been recognized as more important in the course of the pandemic. So how we achieve this, not only do we have sort of a unique vision, I'd say, but we also have a unique approach. This goes. So we actually do 3 different things. We do help communities on project development. And here we bring together infrastructure investors, philanthropies, utilities, governments, and other community stakeholders to think through how can a fiber optic project be built that's attractive to investments or government grants, and that offers substantial community environmental benefits. We really want to bring together these synergies for the benefit of the community. We also engage in policy research to understand what are the levers that communities can use and governments can use to effectuate these synergies and this change. And exciting, as Andrew mentioned, we undertake and lead technology demonstration projects where we lead projects that really demonstrate broadband synergies and sort of create not just white papers that we all can read, but actual on the ground, real life experiences of how broadband and other applications can benefit the community as a whole. And we think that these 3 activities, really leads to universal, affordable, very important, as Debra was mentioning, broadband and broadband-enabled applications for healthier communities, enhanced educational opportunities, economic development, lower CO2 emissions, and resilient communities. Resilience you can think of in a variety of different ways, but certainly helpful. So to get more in depth, one of the exciting applications that the Department of Energy just announced they're funding us to explore is something called Transactive Energy. And we, for a long time, have been interested and have looked at different synergies between fiber optic networks and the electric grid. And so we have this nice diagram here where you see that the fiber is parallel to the electric lines. And there's, of course, the capital benefit or the capital cost benefit that when you're deploying in parallel to the electric lines, and if you're working with an electric utility, often there's some synergy there just in terms of the capital expense. And if the expense isn't necessarily lower, if you're working with utility, generally there's operational synergy, sort of oiling the gears instead of putting sand in the gears, so that the projects can get deployed more quickly to the community's benefit. There's also, I would say, traditional uses of communications network to aid the electric grid. So there's different ways in which the substations can communicate with the central office to control the voltage and make the delivery of electricity more efficient. That in itself lowers greenhouse gas emissions and also lowers the cost of providing service to electric utility customers, or if it's co-op members. But there's this other exciting technology which the Department of Energy is supporting us to explore called Transactive Energy. So there's lots of different flavors of Transactive Energy, but the one that we're interested in, we'll be pursuing in this project, is where different distributed energy resources, so that can be thermostats, it can be batteries, it can be solar panels, it can be heat pumps for hot water, heat pumps for heating and cooling of a home or another building. All these devices communicate here on these red lines over a broadband network. And in this particular technology, these devices communicate at least every 5 minutes, perhaps every 30 seconds. Thousands of these devices communicating over this network. So there's no human intervention. It's human design, but it's all running autonomously or automatically. And these devices communicate with each other in such a way that they collectively decide which devices will take energy from the grid and which devices will put energy on the grid. And that would be in these blue lines here. And so by doing this, the system, the transactive system, can change consumption of electricity at times when the price is very high, or perhaps when the greenhouse gas intensity is high, so you want to reduce consumption. But then it can also drive up consumption when the price is low or when the carbon intensity is low, to achieve both financial and climate goals. And it does this through a market-based mechanism, in that there's this auction process. It doesn't necessarily literally mean that the different owners of the distributed energy resources are trading with each other, although there are some proposals for versions of transactive energy where that would take place. But for us, what's most interesting is this idea that the distributed energy resources are communicating in real time over this broadband network. So, it doesn't work without a broadband network. It really requires it. The stronger the broadband network, the more people are on it, the more powerful this type of system can be. So Andrew, that's my quick overview.
Oh man, this is just so painful for you all, I'm sure, to have to boil it down to 10 minutes, because I know each of the perspectives shared here is a multi-hour conversation.
Yes.
And so, but Seth, I mean, I think I appreciate the last point around sort of it doesn't work without a broadband network. Where are you seeing examples and or partnerships that are embracing this and that are at the forefront and are leveraging their broadband infrastructure to be able to achieve these kinds of partnerships and activities?
Well, the early research on transactive energy, of course, took place over broadband networks, but it's actually been explored for some time. So those wouldn't necessarily be the broadband networks that we think of today. But there are electric utilities that are very much seeing broadband as a synergy, both for community benefit, because they know that their community needs broadband, but also as a synergy for their operations, whether that's on a very basic level, meter reading or controlling their substation, or as a potential way of leveraging their assets to help the community as a whole. So there are utilities that will build out fiber for these purposes, perhaps with something like Transactive in mind. And then because the marginal cost of a few extra fiber strands is almost zero, they will offer those extra fiber strands in some way for the community to use for broadband. Now they have to, of course, the broadband system has to pay for those fibers at market rates so that everything is kosher in terms of where the costs and funds are going. But that can make a big difference for how well or how easy it is for a community to deploy broadband, because the asset's already there and the electric utility has the expertise and the relationships to build out that fiber into the community. So we see that as making a big impact and can really make a difference.
The statement that you just made, I think, is a pretty fantastic frame for the conversation at large of, leverage the assets to help the community as a whole. In many ways, right, different set of topics and ingredients, but a very common focus that Deb was just talking through. And certainly that was prominent throughout Susan's remarks. So, what's great about this is that if you're in today's session and conversation, you're a bit of a glutton for pain or have, a pretty significant orientation towards systems change is maybe a better way of putting it. Just in case planning, deploying, designing broadband isn't complicated and nuanced enough, we want to talk about how to create economic opportunity for all people and leverage our energy and electricity systems to be as efficient as possible, hopefully with a positive impact towards our climate resilience. Just in case it's not complicated enough. So Susan, you seem to have a tremendous knack for distilling the complexity of these intersectoral objectives. And so I guess I just really welcome your thoughts, and you started to sort of tilt towards this in your remarks earlier, but part of today's conversation is, in the not too distant future, what do these orientations of leveraging our assets to benefit the community as a whole, what does that look like in the not too distant future for us from your perspective?
Well, I think it actually is a pretty simple picture, Andrew. Your job it's easy. So 100 years ago, people would have asked, well, what's electricity for? It's so expensive and 80% of the cost is labor. We can't afford to build it. What are we going to do? And what both Seth and Deb are helping us do is see that there are applications for a persistent, cheap, world-class data network that bring more partners to the table to de-risk that investment, to lower the cost of capital, to infuse capital into making this persistent service available. So the future, if we get this right, is to have all, an entire chorus in Maine saying in harmony, we need this. We need this for economic development, for inclusion. We're going to have many more climate migrants of all kinds coming. We're really worried about greenhouse gas emissions. We really want to make our state a leader in the country for its basic infrastructure that is helping everybody lead a thriving life, because that's what Deb's talking about, making that persistent, affordable data connection available to everyone in Georgia allows a 5-year-old who's a genius to make her way through the world and not be held back by not having access to these basic inputs to human life. And what Seth is saying is, look, we do this right, we can actually have a host of win-win payoffs for everybody. But all too often, at every level of government, things are treated in silos. You're either in climate, or you're in economic development, or you're in planning for infrastructure. This issue crosses everything and requires all those partners to be at the table. And what's so significant, particularly about what Seth is saying in terms of bringing new partners to the table, is that it becomes less overwhelming if you think about joining up with other partners who share your interests, but maybe aren't aware of what you're up to, and have great incentives at really very little cost. It's gravy to them to add an extra fiber strand, as long as they can share revenue from what's happening. So for me, this is all pretty simple. Actually, it's a big vision for making sure that we have, just as we make sure we have clean water for everybody in the state and functional electricity, same thing here. Data that's persistent, reliable, never have to think about it, just vanishes into the background and makes possible all of these human empowering steps.
Where that mute button gets hard to click sometimes. So Susan, I appreciate that. And I think that, given your global travels and your global perspective, I think it's, where do you see that sort of simple future already emerging? I know certainly you make good reference to Korea and to Sweden. Yeah. And, I think that part of what today's conversation is a little bit about, sometimes we get hung up on the terminology and the sort of lexicon of smart infrastructure and smart communities. And that means some things to some people and nothing to other people. And, but it is about sort of how we relate to our infrastructure and our assets towards a sort of general quality of life. Yeah. Where are you seeing that sort of manifest in a way that sort of achieves those goals of the future?
Look, we are not Sweden. We will never be Sweden, but actually they are, and Denmark are great examples of this very sensible, clear-eyed, ruthless kind of thinking that is just, look, why aren't we, for example, having fiber running beneath all of our streets that do things like time the traffic lights, make sure the buses get, the same right place at the same time, not wasting energy? Why aren't we using data and information to store excessive heat that is thrown off by steam plants, and then maybe bringing that out to other parts of the community? Why aren't we just understanding what this grid can do for us and harnessing it in to support all of our activities, whether it has to do with greenhouse gas emission or making sure that the city runs better? It's just sensible to them. In fact, the mayor of Stockholm at one point looked at me beseechingly and said, "Can't we help you? What's wrong with you people? Why can't you do this? Because we have the smarts, and it's not that hard." It just, of course, it's hard politically. It requires a ton of planning. People in Denmark said the same thing to me. They said, "What do you mean? You have all these cable guys who have a monopoly over service in cities, and they pay back 5% of their video revenues to the city so that the city never cuts away from them? That's nuts. That's nuts. You've got everybody bought into this system that isn't working." And Denmark is one of the really leading countries when it comes to what you call smart grid. It's just, you can think of all of this as measuring and understanding how resources are used, and then making available additional resources so that people can make good decisions about their lives and inform themselves and stay connected. So it's just information flows and data all harnessed in the service of thriving lives. You can think it's sort of like pre-kindergarten for human lives. We all need this. We all need it. And it's just a matter of making the decision that it makes sense to have it available at a reasonable cost.
I have an emerging hypothesis for our conversation today, and I welcome folks pushing back on it. And I'll sort of frame it and then welcome any of you to respond. And this also is a prompt to all of our participants. Please feel free to start pinging with some questions. I see a couple already starting to queue up there, so I'll be coming to them. And then Deb, also would love to sort of come back to your perspective around sort of the special sauce of enabling that type of collaboration and partnerships that you've been discussing. But so my hypothesis is along these lines, and this is the first time I'm verbalizing it, so it's going to be pretty raw. But in many ways, what I'm hearing you describe, Susan, is that the capability that is enabled through the type of infrastructure that we're talking about enables energy, right? And not just the type of energy that we can optimize, Seth, the way in which you're describing, but really an energy to do more for all of our goals and all of the different priorities that we have. And with that energy, really in the form of data, with capability, with access to information, with the ability to participate in a digital economy, all of that energy is going to be pretty hard to tap into. And so we should really tap into our sort of most fundamental resource, which is that of all of the people whom are utilizing the systems and have their own creativity, their own insights, and their own set of priorities to utilize the energy and the data. Which to me, Deb, kind of comes back to sort of the fundamental purpose that you described around inclusive innovation is how are we enabling sort of the next generation of entrepreneurship, of small business, of solutions to our systemic priorities in a way that's not been possible before. And so, I'm curious if how folks react to this sort of general hypothesis. And Deb, I'm hoping that that's a little bit of a prompt for you to sort of talk through how does the network of partnerships that you're seeing enable economic opportunity for the people who have had the least amount of access to it?
Yeah, a few thoughts. I think for the US, it's ultimately very hard to compare ourselves with Scandinavian countries or Nordic or Asia. It's just very different in terms of the governance, culture, access. So, that's very hard for comparison. Ultimately, when you describe it as a special sauce, I think that's actually a deterrent, because what we want to say, and Susan said this really well, is that public infrastructure or connectivity is a public infrastructure must. It is a critical need. And when you say it's a special sauce, that means you must have particular ingredients or extraordinary abilities or talents in order to get this. And that deviates from the fact that everyone should be able to do this, because it's a requirement to improve the human condition and improve the quality of life. So you take away that extraordinary barrier and really just meet them where they are in terms of public-private partnerships. It does not need to be, the most sophisticated or resource-intensive restraint. When we started in Georgia, and I think you're doing the same, frankly, in Maine, is just put in a group of really passionate, committed folks together, along with state leadership, and get in civil and corporate leaders around a common mission, right? And I think that makes it a little bit more feasible than thinking you need something really special or extraordinary. I don't think at this stage, especially during the pandemic, nobody is going to disagree with the fact that we need connectivity. I think that the pandemic actually created that sense of urgency and that window of opportunity that might have maybe been more difficult if we didn't have that. And so with that barrier removed, I think this is a really common ground to move forward on. And the conversation then becomes, how can we do this? What can we do? What can you contribute? What can we do together? And I think those conversations, especially one done at the local level, are about a lot more interesting because it's really fitted to the local context and the local conditions.
I want to, I have more to drill into on that, but I want to be mindful that there's good questions that are bubbling. And so Seth and Susan, I welcome some of your response, both to Debra's response and to some of the hypothesis that I posed. But Jeff Letourneau is with us as the Executive Director of Network Maine, and certainly a real luminary of connectivity here in Maine. Jeff, you frame a good question. Would you mind posing it to the panelists, please?
Sure. I just posted in the chat a question about the value stack that Seth described earlier as he was speaking in terms of attracting equity funding. My question really revolves around how does public ownership of that base asset, the fiber itself, does it negatively impact attracting such private equity investments, or is that something that there's ways around?
I don't think that public ownership in and of itself would distract from these synergies. I mean, if anything, it could make it easier. I mean, that if you're going to have private investment, there is a little bit of risk that if you're only bringing private investment in for transactive energy, which actually has a very small capital cost, that that might be challenging. But in terms of the overall synergies of themselves, I think public ownership is a fine thing. It doesn't dissuade the deployment of synergies like transactive energy at all. Is that on point, Jeff? Is that?
Yeah, great. I appreciate the answer.
I would just add, it really just comes down to funding versus financing, right? When you're thinking about this large infrastructure, you have a certain amount of investment costs that needs to come in, especially for this scale of connectivity. But it's really about operationalizing it and where you get that business model in terms of ongoing maintenance.
Great. Susan, did you have anything you wanted to chime in there with?
I just want to say how great it is to see Jeff, who's such a wise expert, and I'm just glad he's here. I think public ownership can also be public oversight. I want to be deft about this, that the point I'm trying to get across is without the public involved at the lowest level of the network, either through oversight or ownership, there is a risk that the entire system gets eventually bought out by a private entity that doesn't share the same public values that the state of Maine would. And that we've seen this all over the place in the United States, where, let's say, a private equity group buys up a network that is in their interest. They're not malign, but it is their interest to cherry pick the wealthiest customers, to drive up prices as high as possible to those customers, and to soak that asset for as much revenue as possible. And when we're talking about public work, which is really what this is, basic infrastructure, those goals don't align with the public goals. So that's the risk of having no involvement of public oversight or ownership at the very lowest level of a network.
And thank you for the 3 responses. This will be part of the discussion in the next open access session following this. Thank you.
Jeff, great work in teeing up our next session. It's almost as if there was somewhat of a design for it. Almost. Hey, what we lack in good planning, we make up for in good luck. Seth, can you, since we're talking about sort of both public ownership and the balance of private partnerships, I realize this is probably an incredibly complex conversation and question. What do you see as necessary in the form of public ownership with the integration of our electrical and communication infrastructure, such that to really be able to optimize and maximize the value of the types of models that you're exploring and the technologies that enable the benefits therein?
I think I second Susan's point. It's really more of the oversight than as to who ultimately owns the underlying equity in the project. in our Connected Communities pilot that's funded by the DOE here in Maine and New Hampshire, there will be a variety of different partners involved with different ownership of different parts of the assets. And what's important is that the overall vision is maintained. Of course, we have to have the vision maintained over the course of the pilot, but we want, when you deploy these technologies, you want the vision to be maintained for the life of their operation going forward. So I don't know that there's any particular ownership structure that is determinative for its success, as long as you can manage to have all the parties working together, aligned in the right way. Now, there might be some benefit to having all the parties publicly owned, just because they're in principle they should be serving the community, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a requirement or always would be the case.
I appreciate that. I also want to highlight Nick Batista's point in reference to the role that broadband infrastructure plays in the Maine Won't Wait Maine's climate plan. And so, Nick, I appreciate that point of reference, and I also welcome you to make a remark or pose a question to the group around how we achieve some of those goals and what you see as being critical components of that.
Yeah, thank you. I think from where I sit with a foot in both the climate conversations and in broadband conversations, I don't know that we're talking about the same things. And I don't know that we have quite, particularly on the climate side, fully put together the fact that if we don't solve broadband, if we don't close the digital divide in rural Maine, we're not going to hit our climate goals. And I think there's some of that's on the climate conversation. I think some of that's on the broadband conversation, to be better about bringing in these other sectors where broadband is critical to moving that sector forward, but maybe not top of mind for them. So that's question, comment. How does that fit? Maybe Deb, I'd be curious about how that fits with some of the inclusive innovation work that you've been thinking about.
I actually was typing that down, because I think what you said is very, very spot on. And if we don't close the digital divide, we won't hit our climate goals. And I think that's something that we haven't quite got to in Georgia, honestly. And I think it's because it's overlaid in some larger political discussions, which means that it's harder to do that, honestly. When we talk about inclusive innovation, it's very bipartisan. I have, as you know, it's Georgia. So I have Uber Red and Uber Blue in my board, and everything in between. And I have to weave a very careful line. And I'm talking with friends here. So, but, getting into some of those climate conversations is harder to do. And so I haven't quite linked it that way yet. It doesn't mean that I don't want to, frankly. And frankly, as Andrew and Susan know, I started in sustainable development and climate resilience. So this is very much the base. But right now it's more focused on entrepreneurship, economic development, because that is more politically feasible. And if there is a secondary benefit of climate, then so be it. But we haven't quite linked it to that degree. But I actually typed that down, and I'm actually thinking of how we could do it, because we do have a separate public-private partnership that's called Georgia Drawdown, and that's actually put in, and I can put the link in the chat box, but it's actually forcing the corporate sector to do carbon emissions reductions through a business roundtable. So that's something that is done, right? So it's like the corporate side voluntarily doing carbon emissions reductions together, and the universities like UGA, Emory, and Georgia Tech providing strategies, business strategies, essentially for them to do it. But it's not as supported by the state, if that makes sense.
Hey, Andrew, if I could, I think that just as Seth's project is bringing more partners to the table to provide capital and de-risk the entire enterprise and provide more benefits for the community as a whole, so too using not only climate mitigation, but also climate adaptation goals for Maine brings more partners to the table. That yes, you want to reduce your emissions, you got to also get ready for these gazillion migrants that are going to show up and plan ahead for them. And that this really is a bipartisan issue. This is about basic infrastructure and people being able to live. I'm in South Carolina right now because I'm working on climate adaptation here. And people are really coming around to the idea that things are going to change quickly and they're going to have to move probably, even though it's a deep red state. So I think that the whole country eventually is going to lurch this way. I think Maine can be a leader in putting all of these arguments on the table for why this basic infrastructure is needed.
Just if I could speak from a
please.
technical perspective, it's absolutely true that Maine will not be able to achieve its climate goals without broadband connectivity. I mean, you have to have the load flexibility that broadband can enable in order to match renewable production. Otherwise, there's a cap. I had a student team here calculate the cap for California. It's like 35 to 40% renewables is the cap without load flexibility. Or a massive investment in batteries, which is probably the more expensive way to go.
I think a pretty overwhelming, and just so folks know, we are rapidly closing in on the end of our session. And I have been told that folks will appreciate a brief bio break before our next session as we jam in hours of content into a relatively small amount of time. So we are going to be wrapping up here in just a quick minute. I do want to emphasize, I think, a pretty important theme that I'm hearing throughout the conversation is that the ability to include diverse expertise and perspective is truly a special attribute of the work that we're doing around broadband. Whether we're bringing in different expertise through different sectors, or whether we're explicitly targeting the places with the least amount of access and the least amount of connectivity. It is that inclusion of expertise that allows for us to not just achieve our goals, but to really create a future that we want and need to have. And so in many ways, that may be kind of a no-duh statement for most of us, but I feel like it's a pretty important one when we think about where we want to be, not just in the next year or two, but as Susan has aptly said, in the next couple generations. So I hate to have to end this conversation because I really appreciate all of your collective expertise, not just Deb, Seth, and Susan, but this group at large. So thank you all so much for joining us for today's conversation. Krista is going to give us the directions to our next link and how we get there. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day.